first of all, is just kind of touch on some garden landscape soil basics, especially about why it's important to soil test. We'll look at comparative plant soil systems. I know that sounds confusing, but when you see what I mean, it's not confusing at all. And it's really important to keep in mind, your goals for what your plot of land is supposed to do. Then we're going to look briefly at soil tests and interpretation, then on things that can interfere with soil function. And then we're going to jump into amendments and mulches. I'll start off by talking about why amending soils is not a good idea. And we'll talk about mulches as an alternative to that, touching on some problems with certain types of mulches, and then ending up with some management tips in terms of using my personal favorite for mulching any soil, which are arborist wood chips. So systems, what are plant systems? Well, we have the one that we all know of historically, which is agricultural production. And this is monocultural production, where you have acres and acres and acres of the same species, generally with nothing else growing there, because all of the inputs are for maximizing yield of this particular plant. That's not what we're doing. So what we need to really think about when we're thinking about soils and protecting them and making them resilient is thinking about what we're doing in our landscapes and gardens and recognizing it's not the same thing as maximizing agricultural production. The second type of system is the home vegetable garden. And this is actually one of my raised bed gardens. So I'm very much a hands-on gardener. I'm not just somebody sitting in my ivory tower. I do things on the ground. So this is my raised bed system. And it's not like agricultural production because I have perennials in there as well as annuals, and it's a polyculture, not a monoculture. So there are real differences between what you do in your home vegetable garden and what's done in agricultural production. And then we've got home landscapes. And a home landscape is completely different than either of these two things because it is a perennial permanent system. And again, this is actually where I live, over on the west side of the mountains. And you can see that we have some huge oak trees, and I live on our family farm, which we've had for over 60 years in the family, and we've got trees that are centuries old. So it's quite different managing those types of soils as opposed to managing, on the other end, something for agricultural production. So a colleague of mine and I put together this comparative chart, and you don't need to worry about all the parts of it. I want to focus just on a few things. The first is nutrient inputs, and we're talking a lot about soil tests and amendments and fertilizers. So I want to point out that when you're doing intensive agriculture, you have a high amount of inputs. You have to, because you're maximizing production, you're harvesting, you're taking everything away, and then you have to put more stuff in for the next year's crop. It's an annual system, and it's intensive management. In contrast, a home vegetable garden isn't quite as intensive. You're not, unless you're growing giant pumpkins or something, you're really not trying to maximize anything. And you're just providing food for your family, and maybe for, if you're a master gardener, maybe for a farmer's market or something like that, where you obviously want to have good production, but you're not putting everything on the table towards maximizing production of a single crop. And then we've got the low nutrient inputs, which are the permanent landscapes. These are the ornamental landscapes. And amazingly enough, ornamental landscapes, when they are established, recycle about 90% of their nutrients. So it's one of those things you don't have to add stuff to most of the time. Completely different than ag production. So then we can move down to the system goal and matching this up with the nutrient inputs. Obviously, high nutrient input correlates with maximum yield. We have got crops for personal use in a home vegetable garden, and then again, sustaining a permanent landscape with a low input permanent landscape. So I could talk a long time about soil testing, and that's one of the reasons that you're here, and you get to hopefully all do this. And I can go into more detail on many of these things. And if it turns out that we have time and you have questions, I'm happy to do that. But what I'm going to focus on mostly is things that you will need to concentrate on in terms of soil characteristics and things you can kind of leave alone. So there are some things you can do by yourself, and these actually are pretty expensive to do in a lab or impossible to do in a lab. So the first is testing texture. And there's a nice little YouTube video that you can watch. This is our retired soil scientist, Dr. Craig Cogger, who has a really nice little video about how to test the texture of your soil. It's just using your hands. And your hands are really amazing testing probes for this, because you can tell the difference between something that's sandy and something that's silty and something that's clay just by the way it feels and by the way it acts. So his YouTube video is a really useful thing to watch. The other things you can do on your own with pretty simple instructions that are easily found on the internet is testing your compaction of your soil as well as drainage. And I will tell you right now that 99% of the people that come to me and say they have a clay soil actually don't. They have a compacted soil, acts like a clay soil because it's been so degraded and so impaired with constant treading that it just doesn't function anymore. And people think it's clay because it just doesn't seem to function like a normal soil. So don't assume you have clay just because your soil isn't very functional. It could be just highly impacted. That being said about clay, clay is not a four-letter word, and it's more of an issue on my side of the mountains because people here, because we've got wetter soil and wetter conditions, they always assume they have high clay content, and most people don't, not around this part of the country. And the thing is, we need to have clay. And if you look at a soil triangle and think about the very best possible combination of clay and sand and silt you have, will make a loam. And if you look here at this diagram, you can see that a loam could be 40% silt, it could be 40% sand, and 20% clay. You have to have clay. And if you don't have clay, you're not going to have a highly nutritive soil that's going to be able to support plant growth. So what a lab test will do is allow you to find out nutrient content and organic matter content, a lot of other things you can't test on your own. And so a lot of the soil tests that you'll find at the big box stores and in nursery centers, especially those that tell you they can measure phosphorus or something like that, they really aren't very useful. And the best thing you can do in terms of getting a comprehensive soil test is to use a government or university lab, because that's what they're there for. They're there to analyze results. They're there to give you results and to give you recommendations. And it's not to say that private labs aren't good. Many of them are, but there are also private labs that will attempt to sell you something to address your problems. And rather than have to parse out good private labs from bad private labs, I just say focus on the government labs and university labs. Methodology, pretty simple, and most websites will take you through this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But I know there was a question that had been posed earlier about how to sample soils, especially if you have a pretty diverse landscape. And so what you do is, let's say you have, like in my landscape over my shoulder, you can see I've got some lawn and I've got some ornamental beds and trees. You collect soil samples from the same type of area. So I would collect several samples from my lawn bed, and then you mix them together. And you take one sample from that and you turn that in. And then you get a good average of what your lawn conditions are like, or your vegetable garden, or your annual beds, or your perennial beds. So it's pretty easy to do this, and not terribly expensive. People want to know how often to do this, and it really is variable. It depends on what your goals are, what your initial tests are, but I really have to emphasize, you've got to do it once. And I will admit that for decades, I never tested my soil. And the reason was I lived in Seattle. I had a very small landscape. It was all ornamental. I didn't have any vegetable gardens. And when we moved back out to my family farm, all of a sudden I've got an acre of landscape surrounded by pasture, and I can put in ornamental and vegetable gardens all over the place. So I decided, well, I really do need to test my soil. And you learn amazing things from your soil test. There are some tests you'll see when you're signing up that says they're optional. And I've got those in quotation marks, and that's because I don't think they're really optional. I think they are critical for you to understand your soils. The first one is organic matter. You cannot understand your nutrient content unless you know what your organic matter is. And I'll explain that to you as we go through. So understanding your nutrient levels and whether they're high or low or somewhere in between, and then seeing your organic matter, you can kind of correlate the two and figure out where your problems are coming from if you have problems. The second thing is heavy metals. And this is especially important if you're growing vegetables. And this is something that, hopefully you know a little bit of the history of your site, you know what's been grown there before, but heavy metals, depending on what they are, can be problematic, not necessarily because plants will take them up, but because when you work with the soil, you're getting the soil on your hands, you're possibly putting your hands in your mouth, you're breathing stuff in, and heavy metals are an invisible presence. You can't taste them, you can't see them, you can't smell them. It's kind of like the iocane powder in The Princess Bride, if you happen to be familiar with that movie. So testing to know what's a problem is really important for vegetable gardens. And then finally, soluble salts. These can be a problem in arid environments, like on your side of the state, or if you happen to be near a marine side of the state, like I am, and you get these offshore winds that bring in a lot of salt. So those are three things that, even though they'll be set to be optional, which means they're going to cost you a little more money, it's really worth doing so you know what they are. So what I'm going to do briefly is talk about what you should focus on when you get these lab tests back. The most important thing to look at is excessive nutrients, and you will be amazed to see how many nutrients in your soil, assuming you've been gardening for a while, are actually at toxic levels. And this is something that just always startles gardeners, because they're following what they think are good guidelines, but unfortunately many of the guidelines we've followed have been for managing a monocultural crop in intensive agriculture and not for doing what we do. So I'm going to continue to go back to this whole thing about the systems that we're working with, and realizing that the application of fertilizers for an intensive agricultural system is not the same as what we're doing in home gardens and landscapes. So we can't assume that those recommendations are valid. So if we have excessive nutrients, we have to figure out where they're coming from. I'll tell you, it's a lot harder to get rid of excessive nutrients than it is to add deficient ones. You can do it, it just isn't a really fast method. And then again, thinking about heavy metals of concern. And again, it depends on where you live. You all are lucky, because for the most part, you don't have a lot of the industrial waste problems that plague much of the western side of the state, where a lot of industry developed over the last century. Types of things that you might be worried about. If you're using old treated timbers, okay, so these are things that were manufactured a good 20, 30 years ago. They were treated with arsenic and chromium. And those things can leach out, and those are toxic heavy metals. Pesticides. A lot of the older pesticides, pretty much were broad spectrum, kill everything, and they were arsenic based. And there are some areas of Washington State, especially in the Yakima area, that have such hot soils in terms of arsenic that was used from decades and decades of treating tree fruit pests, that it's almost impossible to garden. So if you know the history of your site, not just the last 10 or 15 years, but 50, 100 years ago, it really helps to understand why you should test for certain heavy metals. And then the other one is paint and gasoline, which both contain lead, or used to contain lead. And even though we don't have lead-based paint, we don't have lead-based gasoline, it's important to realize that with lead and arsenic and chromium, all these different metals, that they are elements. They don't go away. They don't break down. They don't disappear. Once they're there, they're there. And you can do phytoremediation and remove plant material to get rid of stuff. But it's important to realize this is not a problem that's going to go away simply by just waiting, because it doesn't. So in terms of commonly excessive nutrients, the big three are phosphate, and magnesium, and calcium. And we are programmed to add these things because they're marketed heavily, and we're told we need to do these things for our plants for specific things. We're told we need to add phosphate to make sure that our plants fruit and they have lots and lots of flowers. We need to add magnesium to have lush, green, healthy foliage. We have to add calcium so that we have improved soils. And this stuff has been pushed on home gardeners for decades. And I will tell you, I used to buy into all of this during the time I was getting my PhD in horticulture, because it's so pervasive. And the opposite information out there in terms of how you manage a home garden landscape just weren't there when I was getting my degree in the 80s. Now the information is there. And so it's part of my personal drive to make sure that everybody understands what we should do with these nutrients. So phosphate, magnesium, calcium will oftentimes be at optimal or excessive levels when you get your soil test back. I'm not going to go into details about what the problems can be, but I do want to mention that I have fact sheets and other publications that deal with each one of these nutrients to help you understand what the problem is, what causes it, how to get rid of it. So these are things that are linked to my sites that are at the end of the notes, which is one of the reasons I really wanted to make sure you got those notes. All the websites that have all of my publications, which are free downloads, are on there. Okay, so now we're going to focus on other things other than the excessive big three. And so organic matter is a really interesting subject, which keeps changing the longer that soil scientists focus on this. So there used to be this perception that we have an ideal organic matter in a soil, which would be between 5 to 10%. And that's what I was taught, and many people have been taught that. And the truth is there is no ideal organic matter. It depends on the site. And I'm going to show you 2 soil tests that put this into perspective so you can understand why it is so variable. Once you know what your organic matter is, you can then look at your nutrient levels. And if you happen to be a gardener who only uses organic matter as a nutrient source, so for instance, all you use is compost, then you can very quickly see if you're adding too much. And so being able to just start correlating your organic matter levels with your nutrients will help you figure out where and when and how to cut back, what to add if you need to try to get things into a sustainable balance in terms of being optimal levels. If you have low nutrients, and on your side of the state, especially if you have a relatively new landscape and garden, you might have low nutrients because it's a drier part of the country. So you may have to add more organic matter. If you have optimal nutrients, that means you've got the perfect amount of organic matter. And you'll see this year after year, if you do testing, that your organic matter stays about the same. If, like many gardeners on this side of the state, if you have excessive nutrients, it is almost always correlated with high organic matter. If it's not high organic, then it's excessive fertilizer out of a bag or a box. But these are things that you can correlate and make decisions about really easily when you can see those numbers right in front of you. So here's one soil test, and this happens to come from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, which is where I've been sending stuff for decades just because they know how to analyze and recommend treatments for home gardens and landscapes. They're not just ag production. And this is my caveat about choosing a lab, is that if you're working with a lab that primarily has been dealing with farmland, they're not going to understand the differences between systems because they just don't do that. They advise farmers on how to grow crops. So you have to make sure that you're choosing a lab that's going to understand that you are working with a home garden and landscape and not with production of a crop. So with this one, you can see that the organic matter is 8.7%, which in our old way of thinking was perfect, right? But then we look at our nutrients and they're all off scale. They're all above optimum. And I prefer to consider this to be toxic as opposed to better than good, because it's not better to be more than optimum. It actually is really damaging to plant and soil health. So if you have too much, your nutrient level is too high, then, and you know that all you've been adding for the most part is, organic forms of nutrients, then you know you're adding too much. So for this particular system, because I know the person who did this, she doesn't use, bagged or boxed fertilizers, but she uses a lot of really rich organic matter. So she knows she needs to cut that down to get her nutrient levels down, okay? In contrast, this is my soil. And you saw it in the first slide, the slide that had the blue tarp with all the soil on it. That's actually where I live. And that's my soil. And I know how it's been treated for 60 years because we've had it in the family that long. And so the first thing you'll note is that I have pretty much optimal levels of nutrients, which is great. But my organic matter is 12.8%. So people look at that, and I would have looked at it 5 years ago and said, it's too high. It's not that 5 to 10%, sweet spot. But I know my soil, I know my site, and I can see that I have optimal levels. So as you can see from the picture behind me, I've got some oak trees, and those of you that have oak trees know how tough oak leaves are, and they take a long time to decompose. So the organic matter in my soil, which has been housing oak leaves for centuries, is pretty high, but it's because the organic matter is really slow to break down. This isn't a bunch of compost. This is slowly decomposing leaves. So the type of organic matter is really important, and you can't see that because tests don't show you if it's rapidly decomposing or slowly decomposing, but that's why it's important to know your site. So this is a really nice contrast on how high organic matter doesn't necessarily mean too many nutrients. It depends on the site, and this is why there is no perfect number for any site. There is a perfect number for your site, and you have to figure out what that is. So when we get these tests back, there's all these things you see on here. And I'm not a soil scientist. I mean, I've been trained in soil science, but that's not my PhD. And I look at a lot of these things. I don't know if you hear that noise in the background. It's the flicker who's banging on our chimney. So I will apologize for that noise as well. Anyway, in terms of the material, the information here, there's just a lot of information. But there's a lot of things we can ignore. I mean, it's kind of informational, but it's not necessary to deal with. pH is the first one, because it is what it is. You cannot permanently change the pH of your soil. You can change the pH of the soil in a pot, or possibly even a raised bed. You cannot change the pH of your landscape soil. So you pretty much just have to acknowledge the pH is what it is. That being said, that doesn't mean, even from pH 4.9, which is me, pH 6.7, which is probably closer to you all, it doesn't mean you can't necessarily grow certain plants. And the reason for that is that there is no ideal pH level for any species. So I'm sure I'm throwing all kinds of bombs and all kinds of things that you've believed for a number of years. But again, I want to use my landscape to demonstrate this. So I'm actually right behind that window right there. So this is my view from my home office. And you can see that I have lots and lots of stuff that grows here. A lot of this is acid-loving things like rhododendrons and azaleas. I also have wisterias, and we've got our native conifers in the background. But here on the left, you can see there's a viburnum. Now, if you look at viburnums, any type of viburnum, you will see that they will be this range of tolerance, they call it. And the ranges of tolerance have been decided through lab experimentation, not field work. And when you look to see what a viburnum likes, they kind of like medium to working towards alkaline soils, supposedly. Okay, I've got lots of viburnums, and they're really happy. And we have a pH of 4.9. They don't care. And so when you know that plants can grow well in your area, regardless of what tags say, believe your eyes. If things can grow in your area that supposedly won't grow because of pH levels, don't believe it. And if you do have to grow something or want to grow something that does require a lower pH, you could always grow those in containers, because containers, and I mean by containers, not just small little pots, but big containers, you can change the pH of those systems pretty easily because it's a restricted soil volume. You just can't change the pH of the landscape soil. There's just no way to do it. So don't worry about the pH. It is what it is, and you can garden regardless of what the pH is. Second thing not to worry about is if something is low, it doesn't mean it's deficient. So here's my soil test again. You can see that I have low phosphorus. It's not deficient, it's low. If it was very low, that would be deficient. But when you look at what it actually is, it's 3.4 parts per million, and the optimal range is 4 to 14 parts per million. So it's just a hair below. So rather than throw a bunch of phosphorus on, you want to go outside and see, do I have a phosphorus deficiency in any of my plants? And if you don't see widespread phosphorus deficiency, then don't add anything. You don't need to. One of the things that you'll get with your test back is a fertilizer recommendation. And keep in mind that, this is all very well-meaning, but these things are based on lab extractions. And it's a conservative measurement. So they take the soil, they extract it with various types of reagents, and then they measure amounts of various things. It's not what happens in nature, okay? It does not take into account the ability of roots to acidify an environment. It does not take into account the ability of microbes to mobilize nutrients, and mycorrhizal fungi in particular can mobilize nutrients that roots can't get, but they can do it because they're part of the root ecosystem. So just because the lab extraction says that something is low, don't assume that the plant can't get it anyway, because it probably can, unless you can see that it's deficient. So what you do before you add anything is you go outside your ground truth to find out whether or not you really do need to add a particular nutrient. And this just involves looking for deficiencies. So I'm going to give you a deficiency that lots of people have seen on both sides of the mountain, which is iron deficiency, which is when you have the green veins with the yellow in between. That's called intervenal chlorosis. So when you have that, you know that you have either a deficiency of iron or manganese. Those are the two that are usually symptomatic for this particular problem. But then you need to look at your soil test. And if your soil test says, I have plenty of iron, and you can see here 4.2 parts per million, and it's in the range of optimal levels of iron. So we don't have an iron deficiency in the soil. We have another problem, and the problem here is excess phosphate. So I mentioned before that we have three elements that tend to be excessive to the level of being toxic, and phosphate is number one. So if we have 45.2 parts per million, and the ideal range is 4 to 14, we've got way too much. And what phosphate does is actually inhibits the ability of plants to take up iron at the root level. And that's why you'll end up getting these problems. So there's a deficiency in the leaves, but not in the soil. Adding more iron is not going to help. Getting rid of the excess phosphate will take care of the problem. Okay, so that's kind of a really quick overview of the types of things you might see in your soil test and how you might interpret those. And there's much more to that, but since I've got lots to cover tonight, we're going to move on to thinking about other things that will impair the ability of your soil to function well, and that will show up in problems in your plants. So the first one is compacted soil. I mentioned this before, and you could test your compaction. If you have compacted soil, you're going to have low water and oxygen content because the pore spaces are all smashed together. So there's literally no space in between the particles of soil for oxygen and water to exist. Then we have amendments, and I have a great acronym for this in terms of what it causes. So if you amend your soil, amending means working stuff into the soil, you can cause poor oxygen and water movement, and that my acronym for that is POW. So poor oxygen and water movement is POW. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. If you have drainage improvements, which you see I've got in quotation marks because they're really not improvements, that's also a POW. That's going to cause some problems, and we'll discuss that. And then finally, if you use a sheet mulch of any sort, that's also going to be a POW. So these are the things you want to avoid because they're going to inhibit the ability of soils to function properly. And if soils don't function properly, roots don't grow properly. And if roots don't establish, then the crown doesn't grow well. So it all depends on what's going on underground. So first of all, just terminology. Amending and mulching are two completely different things. So amendment means working something into the soil. And this is obviously something based in centuries of agriculture, but even farmers are now getting away from amendments and doing no-till agriculture because there's such a damage to the soil system when you continually till it and work stuff into it. Instead, mulching is preferred. It's natural. It's what happens if we're not there to do it. It's just stuff being laid right back on top of the soil and then being worked into it by decomposers and gravity and water and little critters that come up and pull it down like worms and moles. This all goes back to system goals. If we are managing a highly intensive production of a monocultural crop, we might do amendment. But we shouldn't be doing that when we're looking at home vegetable gardens and most especially landscapes because the soil is different in those systems and we need to maintain it in as sustainable a level as we can. So when we go and amend soil, what happens is that we're going to disrupt the structure and we disrupt its function by changing its texture and its functionality. So this is what happens. You will have hydrology disruption. That just means you're going to have water that might sit on top. Sometimes it's called a perched water table when you amend a soil. Sometimes you'll get subsidence, and that just means that everything kind of settles over time. And all of a sudden you've got these depressions in your landscape or your entire soil bed and your raised bed is only half as tall as it was the year before. That's all that organic matter breaking down. And then, as I mentioned, we can have nutrient overload by just having too much of a good thing. So this is some work that was done at WSU back in the 50s in the soil science department. And they were looking at what happens when you have these different soil textures. And so we have a silt loam that's sitting on top of a layer of sand. And then we've got an Erlenmeyer flask that's sitting on top there, kind of dripping water in. And you can see this dark circle is the water that's going into the soil. So our head says, okay, we've got this water's going into this silty soil, very finely textured. It's going to hit that sand. It's going to pour right through because sand is so coarse. But it doesn't. It stops. It will stop every single time because the texture is different. And this is a water substrate phenomenon. If it's going between two different textures, the water will stop moving quickly and it starts going sideways where the texture is still the same. And so you're getting lots and lots of horizontal movement, but no vertical movement because of that barrier. Finally, when you get so much water in there that it's completely waterlogged, it's heavy and it's going to start pushing its way through that barrier. And eventually the water moves through. That's the way that a French drain works. Okay, that's what a French drain is going to do. It's going to whip away all of that water. But in the meantime, you've still got this completely saturated soil sitting on top of it. So a French drain does not improve drainage. So that's the first thing I want to really press home is that a French drain will get rid of standing water, but it's not going to help a waterlogged soil. And it happens in pots. And so you can find dumb pictures like this on the internet where people are talking about putting rocks and other crap on the bottom of their pots. And they say, you know, they're doing this to help drainage. And it looks really pretty because it's one of these Photoshop, you know, not Photoshop, it's one of these, you know, artfully arranged photographic things. But if you stop and think, when you go to the nursery, you never are buying plants that have drainage material in them. It's the same stuff all the way from top to bottom, right? They're not going to grow plants in situations where they're not going to grow well. So a uniformly textured soil in a pot is the best drainage. What happens again with having a different texture underneath, you know, this finely textured organic matter is the water's going to stop moving. It's going to start backing up until it's finally so saturated that it pushes through. And I've actually done this, and you can do it also. You can just do this very easily with plastic cups or whatever you like. And you can see here that I've got you know, rocks at the bottom, and then I put some soil on top, and I added water. And you can see that, you know, there's soil here, and there's some murky water on top. There's no water that's going through the pebbles. It's just sitting there. And it's really funny when I posted this in our Facebook group, people accused me of cheating and you know, not having a drainage hole, and there was some kind of vacuum that was holding it back. But no, I had a hole in the bottom. You know, it could easily move through, but it couldn't move through because water just stops. Eventually it overcomes this because this is a very silly little system, and water will run down the side of the cup and will go underneath. But you can see the problem. This is what happens when you have these different textures of soil in a pot, in a container, in a raised bed, in a landscape. You're going to have a reduction of water movement. And the second problem is the subsidence. So this is a great landscape to look at because you can see that right where those red lines are is where the soil was and where the soil is. And so over time, all the organic matter in this topsoil has just decomposed and not been replaced. So the entire system sinks, and you can tell because the root ball of this tree here is now sitting like a little island on top of everything because it's clay. It's on clay. It's not going to change. But everything around it has subsided, and it looks silly, and it's really not a very healthy soil system. So instead of amending, what we need to really get back to is mulching, and, you know, really following what nature does. There's a certain amount of you know, just happiness we get from working the soil and doing things to it. But a lot of it needs to be just observing and then doing what nature does. And the nice thing about mulches is that there's all different kinds of mulches, and they serve a lot of purposes. And like the talk suggested at the beginning, we're talking about protecting our soils, especially when it's hot and dry. And the best way to do that is with mulch. There is nothing worse for soil health or plant health than a bare soil. That is the absolute death of many, many, many soil systems and plants. So you can have mulches, and they're going to ideally disturb the soil very little. They're going to reduce compaction, they protect the soil environment, and they reduce weeds. And in the notes, there is a nice chart that I've included. I'm not putting in here tonight, but it's just for your reference. It has all different characteristics of a good mulch, and it kind of compares different types of mulches, plus, minuses, and zeros. I've decided now not just to list mulches, but to put my stamp on it in terms of what's acceptable and what's not, because there are so many bad mulches. There's unfortunately more bad mulches than good mulches. But acceptable mulches, in my book, are living mulches, which could include cover crops, which might be good for your vegetable garden, and ground covers for your landscape. You could use inorganic mulches, which on your side of the mountain is often a very good idea because you're in a drier area. It's easy to find these things. You don't have the weed problem we do. And so you can use lots of things that can be very artistic or very inexpensive or whatever you like in terms of protecting the soil from compaction and helping maintain moisture and moderating heat and all those other great things that good mulches do. And then we've got things like coarse organic mulches. I'll mention bark and nutshells in a little bit. And you see I have that put there as limited, and I'll explain why. Leaves, pine needles, straw, and wood chips are things that are good choices, some better than others, but these ones are what I would consider to be acceptable. So living mulches, I think, are the most fun. I use them a lot. The smaller your landscape it is, the easier it is to do this because you can intensively water. So this is the drawback. If you use a living mulch, it means more resources because it's a living material. But you can do such cool things. I mean, you can really do some nice work with living mulches. And it's aesthetically pleasing. It's good for plant health. It's good for soil health. And it gives you an area where you can walk or drive that's not going to be damaged. There's lots of inorganic mulches, as I mentioned, to use before. And you can have a lot of fun artistically with these. And they don't add nutrients, which could be a drawback, or it could be really desirable. If you have an area that's overly loaded with organic matter, then maybe you want to use a mulching part of it that doesn't add more nutrients to the system. In dry environments, inorganic mulches are great because that's what's naturally there, depending on exactly on where you live. There's not a lot of organic matter, there's not a lot of moisture, decomposition is slow, and stone mulches are great. Where there's more moisture, they're not so great. And the reason is because water will run off of surfaces and get into areas like here along the sidewalk. In the mulched area, you can see weeds have landed there along with water. Now we've got weeds popping up because it's a perfect place for weeds. And you give it enough time and it gets really bad. And these are, fist to football sized pieces of cobble here. And there is just literally no way to weed this, because it's a heavy mass of stone, but with sufficient light and sufficient moisture, you're going to have all kinds of weeds pop up. So this is not a desirable outcome at all. The list of unacceptable mulches is unfortunately very long. It includes things like synthetics, which include landscape fabrics, plastic, and rubber. They are not permanent weed control. You'll see them advertised as such. There is no such thing as permanent weed control. And putting down something that says it is going to be more damaging to the soil than to the weeds. Soil and plant health are highly impacted by synthetics for a variety of reasons. The sheet mulches themselves, things like plastics and fabrics, are going to create those Powell conditions. They're going to reduce oxygen and water movement. And rubber mulches will catch on fire. So that's even another reason not to use those. There are some organic mulches that are not acceptable, and these are sheet mulches. So anything that's two-dimensional, things like cardboard or newspaper, are just not good mulches because they also will create Powell conditions. When they dry out, they stay dry, they don't hydrate easily, and they will also serve as habitat for pests. A lot of people think that wood chips and things that are kind of coarse and chunky are pest magnets. They are not. What rodents like in particular is things they can burrow under. They can't burrow under chips because the tunnels would collapse. They can easily burrow under things like cardboard and landscape fabric and have their colonies that way. Darn it. I need to stop pushing that button. So I call this weed fabric because it grows weeds really well. And you can see that this is not a permanent solution. It's a mess. It has to be taken away. It degrades, it decomposes. The weeds grow on top. and the roots of the trees below are getting nothing. They're not getting water, they're not getting oxygen, the weeds get them all. So the roots eventually will come to grow on top of the fabric or the plastic to get oxygen and water, making it really difficult to remove this stuff. And then rubber mulch, which I think is hilarious. You read the material here, it sounds like it's such a great thing. The problem is that it burns, it's highly flammable. In fact, vandals have figured out that rubber mulches on playgrounds are great things to set fire to because they can actually melt playground equipment with these types of fires. And they're also very polluting. You can't discard tires in the landscape. EPA considers that to be pollution. So my husband, who is a very wise man, said, well, if you can't dump tires because it's pollution, then why can you dump rubber mulch on a landscape and that's not pollution? Which is a very good question because it's the same material. So don't use it. It's bad stuff. It smells. It does nothing good. The organic sheet mulches are harder to convince people not to use. So this is a good example. Here there's actually some burlap there along with some cardboard. It's very soggy and it creates this anaerobic condition because again, water and oxygen don't move well through sheets. And if it's wet, it's going to be very, very wet. And if it's dry, it's going to be very, very dry. A lot of places that are doing restoration planting, they use the wood chips, which is great, but for some reason they just have this methodology of putting down sheets of cardboard first. And I don't understand why. It's not necessary, it's more work, and it really damages soil health. And this is part of the reason why. The cardboard will eventually get exposed, it dries out, water does not pass through it, and all the water in this system is run downhill. So you've got this nice little growth of weeds at the base of the hill, and the plants that you're trying to protect are not getting much of that water. So cardboard mulch is just one of those things that's not a good choice, but it is very popular because of lasagna mulching. So many of the things that gardeners kind of get sucked into are very emotionally appealing because who doesn't love lasagna, right? So everyone wants to do lasagna, and so they want to expand that to their plants because, you know, the mentality is, if I love lasagna, then garden lasagna has got to be great for plants and soils. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's what happens. So this is a no-till method of soil prep, which is a good thing, but it involves laying down all the noodles, which are the sheets of cardboard. This is corrugated cardboard, and then putting on sauce, which is compost, and then just layering as many times as you want. It's very emotional appealing. It's a recipe. It's do-it-yourself, but it's not scientifically based. There are no publications at all to show the efficacy of this method. Nothing. It's all word of mouth. It's all anecdotal. And the problem is with the cardboard. Now, we can also say there's a problem with the organics because if you're adding a lot of compost, you may be overdoing the nutrient levels. We talked about that. Cardboard's a problem. Pizza boxes don't self-destruct. Amazon doesn't ship stuff all over the world in things they're going to melt. Cardboard is going to impede water and air movement until it breaks down. And that can take a long time. And I've had people kind of argue with this and say, well, yeah, it doesn't break down immediately, but eventually it does. And so I always say, well, imagine yourself with a sheet of newspaper, wet newspaper over your face. How easily can you breathe through a sheet of wet newspaper? Now make that into a sheet of cardboard and have it be over your face for weeks or months. You know, and it's kind of silly, but soils are living systems and oxygen has to get in there. You can consider this to be the soil breathing. And if you're impeding that activity, you're going to have unhealthy soil conditions. So we actually did some research. There is now published research on certain types of mulches in terms of their ability to restrict, in this case, gas movement. So we're looking at oxygen and we're looking at carbon dioxide. So we put together these mesocosms that all have bare soil in them, and then some of them have some sort of mulch on top. This one happens to be arborist chips, and then we've got some plastic. And then you can see there are these little sampling ports, and this is where we're going to take aliquots of gas out of the atmosphere and then from underneath, and then see how much carbon dioxide and oxygen is in each of those ports. So we looked at bare soil, which was a control. As I said, there's nothing worse outside than bare soil. But when you're doing a lab experiment, you have to have a control, and in this case, it's bare soil. So we don't recommend bare soil. It's not a good thing in nature. In laboratory experiments, a great thing. We had black plastic mulch. We had arborist chips, and arborist chips are just what come from the tree service when it comes and chips up trees and branches. Landscape fabric, 1 sheet. 1 sheet of fabric plus arborist chips on top. 1 sheet of cardboard and cardboard with arborist chips on top. And we could have gone on forever with these, but there are limits to what you can do financially and realistically. So we just chose things that are commonly used by gardeners and professionally. So without going into a lot of detail about this, we just had various instruments for analyzing carbon dioxide with the Lycor analyzer. We had an oxygen meter. And then you can see in this third picture how we have the mesocosm, has this lid on now, and then it's got some hoses hooked up to it. You can see it's 2 little ports here. And this is how we gathered all the data on each of these systems. So gas was taken out of the port. Here's the one that's underneath the soil. This is the one that's above the soil and the mulch. And then that's put into these analyzers to then figure out how much carbon dioxide and oxygen there is. So the bulk of this paper that we published is mostly math. A lot of it's calculus. A lot of it's very dry. But I took the data and I made a chart because this is a really useful chart. So this is looking at what's called a carbon dioxide diffusion coefficient. And all that means is a measure of how easily carbon dioxide will pass through these different types of mulches. And it doesn't matter how hot it is, how dry it is, how wind or anything else. This is a coefficient, it's a standard. So what we can see is that bare soil, as I mentioned, not a great thing in nature, but for experimentation, it's good. Our control has no mulch, so of course it has the least interference. Wood chips is the next in terms of being a good choice. But I want you to see from this chart on the y-axis, each one of those tick marks is a factor of 10. So think about things like pH scales or earthquakes, and knowing that each change of 1 unit from 1 to 2 to 5 to 6 is actually a factor of 10. So wood chips are not quite 10 times more restrictive than bare soil. Again, this isn't a bare soil you'd find in nature. It's very fluffy. It's not compacted. 1 sheet of cardboard, 1 sheet is 10 times worse than 4 inches of wood chips. 1 sheet of landscape fabric is almost 100 times worse than cardboard. And 1 sheet of plastic mulch is over 10 times as bad as the landscape fabric. So you work backwards and you can say this plastic is 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times worse than wood chips. 10,000 times in terms of restricting the ability for gas exchange, which soils have to stay alive. So this is really useful information for gardeners because it tells you exactly what you should do in terms of really maximizing soil health. So I talk to people about why they use cardboard or these other things, and they always say, I want to smother weeds. But smother is a really bad verb to use when you're talking about soils because everything in the soil needs oxygen. Nothing photosynthesizes underground. So trees are photosynthesizing happily up above ground. Their roots need oxygen. They're not getting it from the trees' leaves. They are getting it from the soil. So we need to not smother the soil. We shouldn't smother weeds. We need to think about what weeds need that we can change without changing oxygen levels. So mulching should protect soil life, not inhibit it. Sheet mulches are just a bad choice because they restrict both oxygen and water. What we do is we eliminate the sunlight. That's why weeds are weeds, because they're able to grow, but they need lots of sun to grow fast. And so if we can eliminate sunlight, we can eliminate the weeds. So understanding that small seeds, and these like most weed seeds are photodormant, means they will not grow and that close enough sunlight. You keep them covered up, they're not going to grow at all. Perennial weeds, same deal. They need light to grow again. So they'll die back to the ground level like your own perennials do, and they're going to need light to generate their new stems. Soil organisms don't need light. They live in the soil. They're not used to having light. They can tolerate it, but they don't need it to survive. Weeds need light. So if you use a deep, coarse mulch, that's going to restrict light because it's deep, but it's coarse, so oxygen can pass through it easily. Carbon dioxide can escape from it easily. Water moves through it easily. So a deep, coarse mulch is the best choice for healthy soil and keeping weeds out. So the question might be, which organic mulch that you want to use? There's lots and lots of choices. You want to have something coarse. You don't want to fine textured mulch because it starts acting like a sheet mulch. It's very fine texture. It's easily compacted. Oxygen doesn't move through easily. Water doesn't move through easily. And what you end up doing is using a very thin layer. And then especially if you're using something like compost, the weeds go crazy because that's a nutrient rich thing. And a thin layer means light is getting through. So deep to keep the light out and coarse to keep water and oxygen and carbon dioxide moving through easily. You want to avoid hydrophobic mulches. So hydrophobic mulch is going to contain wax. Bark is one of those things. Bark mulch is not a good mulch to use. Bark is the outside of a tree and it is naturally going to repel water because it's keeping water inside the tree. So it's kind of like what car wax does for your car. It keeps water from getting in. With the tree, it's keeping water from getting out. So if you make a mulch out of material that is waxy, it's not going to be very good for the soil. Nutshells are just about as bad as are dried needles, but that's not to say you can't use them. And I recommend them for pathways and other areas where you don't have plants growing, but you want to have something that's organic and that's coarse and it's not going to cause a problem and will repel weeds. And these things are good for those types of things where you're not having plants growing. And my favorite are the coarse wood chip mulches because they provide nutrients and organic matter in a slow, sustainable way. It's not a rich organic matter. It's slow to decompose. It will enhance the soil ecosystem and it keeps light out. It also is important for mycorrhizal growth. So there's a lot of beneficial bacteria and fungi that really do well in wood chip mulches. It enhances water and nutrient uptake and protects the roots from pathogens. Some people are worried about wood chips. They're concerned because, well, what about the nitrogen deficiency? Because this is a really high carbon, low nitrogen mulch. Is that going to, cause problems for our plants? The second problem that they come up with is having diseased wood being made into chips. And so I just wanted to reinforce that with lots of research that we've done looking at both pH and carbon to nitrogen ratios, when we looked at, before our trials and then during treatment, all this, none of these measurements was significantly different from each other. So in other words, when we talk about before the trials and the controls, look at those compared to the treatments, everything's about the same. So pH doesn't change, carbon to nitrogen ratio does not change. So no differences, not a problem using these things. And we know that because we can see things coming up without having any kind of nitrogen deficiency. What happens if you mix them into the soil, if you amend the soil, then you will get nitrogen deficiencies and you'll have plants that look like this, very chlorotic, because the microbes are binding up the nitrogen in the soil when this happens. The fungal communities in wood chips are mostly decomposers, and they are in healthy soils, just act as decomposers. They do not infect plants. And in fact, beneficial bacteria and fungi will cover the surfaces of roots, much like our skin and our gastric system are colonized by probiotics. Everyone knows what probiotics are. This is the same thing that happens with plants. If they're in a healthy, aerated soil, they will be completely colonized with harmless and beneficial microbes. And they've done testing looking at Armillaria, Phytophthora, Thyronectria, several of the root rots. And even though they'll put infected mulch directly on top of the soil, it does not affect the plants that are there. So you can use rotten wood, chip it up, and they'll make a perfect mulch, and you don't have to worry about it affecting your healthy plants. I want to just leave with some pictures on this. This is one of my grad students up in Mount Vernon who was looking at different types of wood chip mulches, different depths, different textures. And this is our little layout. It's really a pretty layout. And this is what it looked like initially. And then in the middle of each of this, there's a tree planted. This is what it looked like 3 months later. And this is what it looked like a year later. And what you can see is that with the deepest mulches, there are no weeds, but there's a happy tree growing out of each one of those centers. So the ones that did the best, and this was some really pretty neat research to show that the deeper and coarser the mulch, the better the weed control and the healthier the desirable plant. So think about this, deep layers of wood mulch are going to be the best for suppressing weeds and enhancing the plants. They're low and slow nutrient sources, and you can use them elsewhere. So if you're using them to top dress your raised beds, your vegetable gardens, which I do, when I'm ready to plant, I just move them aside. I'll either replace them or I'll use them in a pathway or something else. You don't have to ever get rid of these things. You can just put them someplace else. So my tips I'm going to leave you with: be sure to look at your soil test results before adding anything. Don't assume you need something just because somebody told you in a nursery you need to buy these products for your plants. That's called upselling. You don't need to be upsold. Look at the levels. If you're optimum or above optimum, don't add anything. Same with the organic matter. Be really careful with this. If you need to add something, and you might want to add nitrogen, that's a common one we sometimes have to add. Just add nitrogen. Don't do a complete fertilizer, just the nitrogen. And this includes fertilizer or rich organic matter like compost. And don't add anything that contains things that are in excess. So the complete fertilizers that are equal amounts of NPK, don't use them if you have excessive P. You don't want to do that. And then make sure that you're not amending the soil. You want to add it to the top of the soil surface, and then you're going to cover it up with the mulch. But again, only if you need it, and most of the time you will not. Vegetable gardens need a little bit more care this way than landscapes, but you'll be surprised on how little you'll have to add even to your raised beds. Think about the roots. They need water, need nutrients, oxygen. They've got to have the oxygen, and they have to have their microbial partners. And those last two things we forget about. The water and nutrients, we forget about the rest. And anytime we start adding stuff like inorganic material or organic material or soil conditioners or packaged microbes or fertilizer or hydrogels or biostimulants or any of this stuff, we're just adding stuff and we're making the situation worse. We need to add things as a mulch, and we need to add them judiciously, as our soil tests will suggest. Don't disturb the soil too much. We want those nice beds that show, some structure where the roots and the mycorrhizae are holding things all together. Taking a rototiller through a landscape or a garden is just death to everything, soils and plants included. Choose the appropriate mulch. I'm not going to tell you which particular landscape ground cover you should use, because that's the fun part of gardening, is picking it out yourself. But use living mulch when you can supply with water. Use inorganic mulch for heavy traffic, and anywhere there's bare soil that isn't covered with one of those other two things, coarse wood chips. And this is actually part of my garden from my place in Seattle, which, as I said, was a very tiny little place, so we could do all kinds of fun stuff with it. And it was quite much more amazing than the green lawn that was there when we moved in. So on my handout, you'll see there's a link to my horticultural myth files, which have been out there for a couple of decades now. Good white papers to run off and understand in terms of how things work. I have all of my published peer-reviewed materials on the ResearchGate library, which is just something that researchers use to kind of self-manage their own articles for other people to look at and share. There's a number of books, as was mentioned at the beginning, that are out there on myths, as well as management, as well as plant physiology for gardeners, and the newest version of Gardening with Native Plants that I did with Art Krugerberg before he passed away. I also have a video series on the science of gardening, which is kind of fun if you like listening to me. My husband will tell you you're crazy, but some people actually like to. We have a blog, and the blog's been in existence since 2009. There's several of us that do this once a week, and we just talk about all kinds of things that happen to attract our attention. We have a Facebook page, which is kind of a clearinghouse for interesting blog posts from other science groups, or just interesting little tidbits about the science of gardening, with a lot of fun thrown in there too. But it's all good, all the stuff that's there in terms of recommended practices is all science-based. And finally, we have our Garden Professors blog group on Facebook, which is managed by about almost 15 volunteer admins now. And it's science-based information. Any questions are welcome. We have all kinds of good discussion. Has to be science-based recommendations, no do-it-yourself, no home remedies, no anecdotes. And right now we've got over 26,000 people from all over the world and experts in many disciplines. And the cool thing about this is that you don't have to, people will email me with questions and it'll be literally weeks before I can get back to them. But you post something on the blog and someone is going to be answering it within a couple of minutes. And so you get a good discussion going and you get a good answer. It's a fun group. And if you do decide to join, be aware that you do have to answer a few questions to make sure you're not a bot or AI. And so that's the only thing you have to do. And then you can just jump in and just cruise and see what's going on and ask a question when you'd like to. And with that, I know I ran a little bit late, but I'm hoping we can have some questions.
Thank you so much. This was really fantastic. And we had a lot of comments in the chat about how everyone's really appreciating the information and what you're providing here. So that's awesome. We do have a few questions rolling in. So as a reminder, feel free to put those questions into the chat. We're going to kick it off with one question that we received with using wood chips. Do you remove the old wood chip mulch or do you just simply add to the top as you go?
Great question. And the nice fun answer is you don't have to move anything. The cool thing about a wood chip mulch, if you've never put one down before, I sometimes recommend people starting off with like a layer of compost first and then wood chips over the top. But after you get that started, the wood chips will actually create their own compost layer. So all you do is put on new stuff and it just will continue to add to this soil building. It's a great way to slowly but naturally build your soil.
Wonderful, thank you. If you have an area of organic sheet mulching under wood chips, is there a remedy other than fully removing the cardboard? Would stabbing through it with a broad fork sufficiently help the water and air movement?
Absolutely. Yeah, I hate to have people have to dig everything. Well, fabric, yes. Plastic, yes. The cardboard and newspaper, a broad fork, something, a hori-hori, something just to kind of break up the surface is just fine.
Perfect, thank you. Do you recommend testing home compost for nutrients?
You can, and I'm glad you asked because most of these soil testing labs will also test compost, and it's a great idea, especially if you're making your own. And if you're concerned about herbicides or anything else that might be in there, whether you're making it yourself or whether you're purchasing it, I will say that if you purchase bagged compost, like at a big box store or a nursery, if you find the Compost Council's seal of approval, it means they've tested it for pesticide residues and heavy metals. So if you buy something that's been certified by the Compost Council, then you know that it's safe in terms of residues. You still don't know what the nutrient content is, and that's always a valuable thing to do.
Wonderful, thank you. Is it okay to use cardboard as the bottom of a raised bed? So they want to build the raised bed over the cardboard and have wood as the sides. It's going to reduce the amount of ability of water to move through. So we have raised beds and we also have soil that's in pretty good shape. So I don't have anything in between the bottom of a raised bed and the soil. If you have a situation where you've got a contaminated soil or some other reason that you don't want there to be any kind of transfer between the soil and what it's laying on, I would suggest actually, in this case, using plastic or something else that's completely impermeable. And then when you build the bed, what you're going to need to do is make sure that the sides are sufficiently aerated so that water and gas can move through the sides, because obviously you're going to be having this issue with perched water if you've got an impermeable layer at the bottom. That makes sense, yeah. Michael says, coming from a farm, we have manure to spare. Assuming that my nutrients are within range, should we not use the manure?
We have cows, and so I'm completely sympathetic to that. And so what we do is, we just kind of went with areas that we need to, we just, kind of compost it in a big area. And then when we're kind of reclaiming an area, which we do on occasion. We'll use some compost there, just kind of give a jump start because we haven't had any plants growing there. But I would say don't just use it routinely, because compost manure can have high levels of phosphate. So do a test first, find out if you've got anything that's a problem. And if you don't have anything that's problematic, I don't see anything wrong with adding a little bit of manure, especially to to vegetable gardens every year, to have their little nutrient boost. But if you've got excess phosphate, I'd test the manure first and then consider what to add.
Wonderful. Michael says, well, then I have free manure for folks. And speaking of testing, do you have a lab that you recommend? Does WSU do good testing for home gardeners, or?
Depending on what county you're in, many county governments, either health department or Department of Ecology or something, will do the testing. Like where I live, I'm in Pierce County, and there used to be a smelter here, and so much of the soil has been contaminated with arsenic and aluminum and chromium and cadmium, all the kinds of stuff. And so they actually do free soil testing because they want people to test before they grow vegetables. But that varies from county to county. Washington State does not have a testing lab for the public anymore. Neither does Oregon State. Neither does any place in California. They all got rid of them because they're expensive. So I actually send my samples to University of Massachusetts at Amherst. That's a very nice website, very interactive, very easy to understand. And it cost me $25 to get a test run. So it takes a little bit of time, but the thing is that they're really good in their analysis and their recommendations, and their form is set up so that it just takes you through stepwise on identifying exactly what kind of landscape or garden you have, and what your goals are for it.
Wonderful. And is it even worth it to try using any of the soil tests that you get from places like Walmart?
You can use pH papers pretty effectively. So, I mean, even going to like a spa center, where your hot tub stuff, and you're testing, the pH of your hot tub, those things actually work really well for soil testing, and they are pretty accurate. The tests, unfortunately, that come in the home kits are not, and the ones for phosphate are impossible because you have to have really specific methodology and equipment and reagents to do a good phosphate test, and there is no home test that will do that. So, I mean, you can, but you'd spend more with that and get less information than you do from just sending something off to a good lab.
That's good to know. And speaking of phosphate, how do we get rid of too much phosphate in the soil?
Yeah, that's the trick. So there's two ways that I know of that would work. Don't go by the end of the internet stuff, which says to add like aluminum or something to bind it up, because you don't want aluminum in your soil. It's not a heavy metal, but it's a toxic metal, so you don't want to have that. The first is to treat the soil kind of like you're doing intensive agriculture, and so you're going to grow something that grows fast, and that might be something that you can use to eat. Or it could be something that you just are going to grow, and then you're going to take it off and compost it. You're not going to leave it on site, but you're just going to remove it. So it's like you're harvesting. And that's a good way to draw down everything. And so you'll have to add some things back, like nitrogen and possibly some other stuff, but that will take down phosphate pretty quickly. A slower way to do it, and this is especially useful if you can't just treat a piece of land like it's a cover crop, is to, again, use the arborist wood chips, because even though they're not going to damage, change soil conditions, below ground, they're going to start taking care of the stuff that's at the interface where the mulch touches the soil, and the microbes there will start using all of those excess nutrients and building lots more microbes. And then, of course, as they die, they would release those. But the perception is the more you grow, the more stuff's going to be bound up in living material as opposed to being in the soil.
Wonderful. What are your thoughts on using wool for mulch?
I've seen a couple things about that. I've got mixed feelings about it. Wool tends to be relatively hydrophobic, and so water isn't held and released slowly from wool. It just kind of repels it. But I have seen people using composted wool, which works a little bit better. And so what I suggest to people is, and I do the same thing with, if you're trying to, create compost or make your own potting media, is just to play with a whole bunch of stuff and see how they work for you. And, it's always worth playing around with them.
Solid advice. And someone has been adding coffee grounds to their composter, and they say they drink a lot of coffee. Should they be limiting how much they're adding?
Actually, I have a fact sheet on using coffee grounds. So if you go to the ResearchGate library and you find my page and you type in on the research bar, coffee grounds, you'll find my fact sheet on using coffee grounds. And you could absolutely use coffee grounds in your compost pile, no more than about 20%. But that's a lot. When you think about the volume of a compost pile, 20% is pretty good. Don't put coffee grounds on straight onto the soil. They look great because they're nice and evenly textured and nice and dark brown, but they can be really damaging to plant life and animal life because there are, some organic acids and some other things that leach out of them that can be pretty toxic.
That's good to know. And if you're using straight compost as a mulch to have a slow release to control weeds, is that all right, provided that you don't already have excessive nutrients?
You mean a slow release? Sorry, run that by again.
So the question, it says using compost as a mulch to control weeds, the slow release of nutrients, assuming no excessive nutrients. So sorry, I'm not sure who commented that, but if you want to clarify.
Because compost is actually a fast release. So compost is a pretty nutrient rich material that breaks down pretty quickly. So that's great as kind of a jump start, but isn't a good mulch in terms of reducing weeds. It's going to actually increase weeds because weeds will like those conditions a lot. The woody mulches are things that are high carbon, low nitrogen. Those are the slow release. And those will reduce weeds.
Perfect. Good to know. And then what about using grass clippings as mulch? Is that not the best to use?
No, not really. The problem with grass clippings is they're pretty fine. They compact pretty easily. They're really nitrogen rich. They tend to mat down. They're great for your compost pile. What we do now, and I mentioned, I think we've got an acre of landscape, and you can see over my shoulder, got lots of lawn there. We have a mulching mower. So it puts the material right back into the soil, and it's a really nice, healthy lawn.
Awesome. And then speaking of disturbance, if there's been a fire, what should they be looking for in regards to contamination in the soil?
Oh, that's a good question. If it was just vegetation that burned, there's nothing really to worry about. If there was anything there before that was residential with like lead-based paint, you probably want to for sure test for lead. Hopefully it wasn't anything that was industrial because there's all kinds of stuff that could be in there then. So it really depends on the history of the site, and it might behoove the person to do a little checking with the county to see what was there in decades past.
Awesome. And then is there any way to tell if the soil at your property has been treated with herbicides or pesticides before you took over the property?
Unfortunately, not easily. You can have stuff tested for residues, but it's pretty expensive, and you'd have to know exactly what you're testing for, and it would probably be enormously expensive. So I think the best thing to do in that case would be to kind of look to see how things are growing. And if weeds are growing, then it probably hasn't been treated with herbicides. If you've got, insects, beneficial insects and stuff around, a lot of these things, well, depending on what they were, the newer pesticides break down pretty quickly. It's just if you have, again, the history of, from decades past of using things that were arsenic based. I mean, you could always do that. I guess if it was me and there was a history, I would probably test for arsenic, because that tended to be the thing that was used most commonly for kind of a broad spectrum pesticide.
Wonderful. And then if you have a large area that you're trying to test, like if you have a farm or just a large landscape, do you have a rule of thumb for how many areas you should be pulling soil from to test?
The nice thing about the UMass website is that it will tell you to kind of divide up your landscape into zones. So I'm just looking outside what we have. We've got lawn. I've got my raised vegetable garden beds. I've got perennial woody ornamental types of beds, and then I've got a few herbaceous perennial beds. So that's what, 5? So the thing is that I would take samples from all of the same thing. So I would take samples from my lawn from all over the lawn, and then you mix them together, and then you take one sample from that. And the same with all the other beds. And so you end up, and this is what I did. I sent off 5 samples just to find out what everything was. And it's important because when they are analyzing the results and telling you information, they're doing it with keeping in mind what your system goal is for that particular piece of land.
That's great. So just to clarify, if you were in a city lot and you had a variety of different beds, you just take soil from each, mix it together, and send that in?
As long as they were all being used for the same thing, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, so you just want to make sure that if they're ornamental, they're ornamental. If it's lawn, it's lawn. If it's something that you're planting something every year, like an herbaceous garden or a vegetable garden, that's kept really, really separated from everything else. So thinking about what the system goal is kind of an easy way of thinking about it.
That makes sense. Thank you. And then I think just one last question here. Do you have recommendations for cover crops or cover crop mixes for vegetable gardens?
Let me think. A lot of people like to use clover because it's a nitrogen fixer. I personally don't use cover crops just because, partially because I'm lazy, and partially because it's really easy for me to manage my beds by just putting down 6 inches of wood chips in the wintertime, because it keeps the weeds out, the soil regenerates. I'm kind of of the school of thought that I like my soil to kind of sit and rest over the winter so that it can be ready to go in the spring. And then when things are ready to go in the spring, I just have to move aside the chips and I can plant. So I don't use cover crops. That being said, I do have some, perennial things like chives and rosemary and sage and things like that stay there all year round.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is all of the questions that we got in tonight. So thank you so much for being willing to stay late and address all of those.
Glad to do it.